Welcome to Healthcare du Jour, where we dish up and digest the latest in healthcare. For the next 30 minutes, sit back as we bring you insight, commentary, and discussion on trending topics to the table, all expertly served up by our host and his guests. Now here's your host, Matt Fisher.
Welcome back, and thank you for joining as we dive into the hottest topics in healthcare. I'm your host, Matt Fisher. On the menu today is Dan Gallagher, Vice President, Strategy and Partnerships at Lyric. Dan, welcome to the show.
Matt, it's very nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, Dan, what I always like to do before getting to the main part of the conversation is to give my guests a chance to provide more of an introduction in terms of who they are and what they do. So, Dan, the floor is yours.
So, Matt, good question. I joined Lyric just about a year ago after some time with Optum and Change Healthcare. I got my start in payment integrity back with a large payer in 2017 and really went into it with a strong project management and compliance background, but really no understanding of the payment integrity space. And I think my natural curiosity, if that's what it is, of trying to figure out how things work, led me to break down the processes in insurance claim handling and get to a point where I understood where the system was broken, where the pain points were, and it left me in a good position to fix that. And in my role at Lyric, after having sat on the other side of the table from many of our, on the same side as many of our customers, I'm now able to look at other players in the industry and emerging technologies and find a way to deliver those products holistically to payers as we advance and capture things like artificial intelligence and machine learning and large data models.
It sounds like there's a lot going on. And before we start unpacking some of that, I know you said you kind of started looking at or being involved with payment integrity issues in 2017. So what drew you into healthcare in the first place?
In all honesty, it's the people. And what I mean by that is, as my career spanned a few industries, I had a few common people that I did business with, mostly around the audit space, that broached multiple industries. So when I was looking for a change, having previously done some assignments on the provider side, I led a PeopleSoft integration for a large provider network. When I wanted to get back into healthcare, I was able to reach out to that network and find people and find the right spot to use my skills. But being a consumer of healthcare and being frustrated, we've all been there, right? Prior authorizations, incorrect billing, those sort of things. I viewed it as a chance to, I'm going to say, make a difference and maybe improve the process.
Yeah, no, I think kind of that core of passion is what draws a lot of people in. It makes them enjoy being within healthcare. So, thinking about what you just said, if you wanted to help improve processes and make it better for people, you referred to payment integrity. So kind of broadly, what does that mean and kind of what do you focus on within that area?
So broadly speaking, payment integrity, sometimes you'll hear the term payment accuracy, is the processes, procedures, technologies that go together to make sure that claims are paid correctly and that the right care is delivered and the right steps are followed in delivery of that care. And that ranges broadly from things like are contracts followed between payers and providers, is the correct coverage in force, correct eligibility, and in a case of multiply insured people or other cases like that, is the right insurance paying first? And then as you get further down, it goes into following things like our favorite topic of utilization management or prior auth, where all the steps there wasn't a procedure that needed a prior auth. And at the end of the day, when done correctly, these steps make it so that the payer, the insurance company reduces their costs, which makes it possible for the patient or the member to have both a more seamless experience and also reduces their costs as well. And when all cylinders are firing, the providers know what to expect, and they get a consistent treatment from claim to claim across the industry.
So when you say when things work correctly, so what are the factors that go into helping ensure that it does work correctly? Because I suspect when you hear the complaints, those are optimistically the minority of cases because people don't tend to complain when it is going well.
Right. And Matt, I think the two places that you see the biggest complaints, right? One is inconsistency. It's I filed with one person for one member and I got response A. I filed what I thought was the same thing for another member and I got a different response. So inconsistency is probably the biggest form of abrasion. The second is just straight inaccuracy, be it an inaccurate reimbursement, an inaccurate call for a prior auth. And those inaccuracies breed their own forms of abrasion as well in trying to get them fixed.
Yeah, and those are great points. It's, when you have those friction points, it causes frustration. And then I guess thinking, and maybe I don't know if this is a pivot or just an expansion on it, but how does coordination of benefits fit into the payment integrity landscape?
So coordination of benefits is one aspect of payment integrity. It's really, it's also referred to as COB. And the goal of that is to determine who the responsible payer is. And if there are more than one payer, which order should the payers see a claim in? And this is a very crucial step in the process that right now, most of the industry does it on a post-pay basis. The payer takes what they know and they use that and assume that to be true. And then at some time in the future, after receiving a claim, they'll look back on it and make sure everything's in line, make sure there's not other coverage, those sort of things like that.
Yeah, so it seems like it kind of then almost fits into the traditional like pay and chase model of how Medicare operates, or I guess maybe not the chase isn't necessarily the right word to use there, but it's pay and review. So kind of, with the like general description of the process, would you be able to walk us through just, kind of what the typical COB process has traditionally looked like?
Sure. So there's really, I'm going to call it two types of COB. You have the passive steps of determining eligibility, which are, hey, is the member paying their premiums, right? It's, is the eligibility information I have correct? And then the second piece of it is what, for sake of this conversation, let's call it active coordination of benefits, which is looking and seeing, has something changed? Has a treatment pattern changed? Has a disability status changed? Has an employer group changed? What has there been an event that creates an entitlement or eligibility change? Or is there something missing that makes the passive data invaluable or not having any value, I guess are the right words.
So then, as you're kind of thinking about those two different steps, what information do you need to be able to gather and kind of work through to enable it to function appropriately?
So there's a couple of pieces of information needed. The first one is current enrollment data. So what's the member roster for a payer? What does that payer think? Who do they think they are covering? The second piece is both current and past claims for a member. And that data is used to really drive the event-based determinations of, does somebody have kidney disease, at which point maybe despite having commercial insurance, they get to a point where they're covered on a Medicare policy. The last piece in that set is really employment status and life change events. So has somebody gotten married? Have they switched jobs? Things that don't necessarily show up immediately, because ultimately across coordination of benefits, one of the biggest challenges is a lag of all this data coming together to get the right picture at the right time.
So, and why does that lag exist? And what can be done to help kind of shorten that potential lag period?
So some lag is unavoidable. There's insurance regulations. It's called the birthday rule, right? That determines when mom and dad are separately insured, who's responsible for the child prior to enrollment. And then there's a period after that change in life event where what was responsible at the beginning may change. So there's some things you just can't avoid because you need certain time to process. You need a social security number to enroll a child, those sort of things. But the other part of it is the prevalence of employer groups, which are great things. Many of us have insurance sponsored by our employers. And just the lag of that, I changed jobs and I changed jobs on the 15th of the month. And the employer group doesn't report that job change to the payer, Blue Cross plan, whoever it is, until the end of the month. And then it takes a few days for that member roster to be updated. So as you can see, you very quickly get to a spot where just batch reporting creates these events where updates happen once a month, but things happen in the course of that month to change that.
Yeah, so and as you said, kind of both of those, appear to be fairly significant challenges. Are from your perspective, are there any other kind of primary challenges on in the COB process that currently exist that you've been focused on?
So aside from the lag in getting data between sources that determine eligibility and enrollment changes, we also have problems with data integration, meaning just things coming from different sources, even inside a single payer, or things coming with enrollment for a new member at a new provider, right? That allows that current plan to know that the coverage is kind of overlapped and that's the end of it. Ultimately, it gets into information sharing, and in many cases, a payer having the awareness of other coverage, multiple coverages, or terminated coverage really causes pain on the industry, which creates that opportunity for vendors and service providers to come in and resolve these issues by bringing an extra piece of information that they have, or maybe a piece of information that's a little bit more current, or having the right technology to integrate multiple sources of data to create a picture of what the most likely scenario is in that instance.
So kind of breaking down what you said, it sounds like, as you said, the integration of multiple data sources can be challenging. And it sounds like it might not just be challenging because you're trying to put, those different sources together, but the systems or technology that the payers are utilizing might not be sufficient. And I think that goes to your last point, which was that's why you might end up having outside parties come in to assist with that process and, hopefully make it occur more quickly and minimize the points of friction.
That's it exactly. And I'd like to think that as technology becomes more commoditized, the ability to integrate these sources, the need isn't as much on the integration. It is today, but that's an opportunity where many payers with new platform-based approaches available for claims editing and claims processing, or just internally for their information, can solve the data integration. But it's who can bring in either a model to build a better prediction or an outside data source that has information that the payer currently doesn't have to help them determine who should be the primary coverer, if that's a word, for a given claim.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense. And kind of picking up what you just said of the integration feels like it shouldn't be the big problem. And as you said, if we can hopefully bring in tools that can get us past that more quickly, what do you see as the bigger challenges that you want to be able to move on and tackle?
So I think the bigger challenge is to get the data lag down as short as possible. That's the biggest challenge. So regardless of who has the data source, we want to have the most accurate information at the time a claim occurs. And that could be something such as getting eligibility data straight from an employer's HR system, right? Instead of getting a once a month feed, how do you get the data and the changes on a push basis? And I don't know that there are many people playing in that space or trying to do that just yet. But then once you go there, the sky's kind of the limit, because you can open up and say, hey, don't just give me when Dan's last day of work was, give me information when Dan's there that could get passed to a provider to help them. So let them know that there's an ancillary benefit for a gym membership, right? So how do we get this information in real time that then can be shared pre-care or during care? So that's the beauty of the opportunity in front of us as we integrate more data and get more things real time, is how do we close the gaps in these systems from where it's simple things like needing a phone call to book a doctor's appointment to now you can do it on an app, right? And you can see real time what's going on. Well, the next logical step is, how do I make sure that I know what my coverage is? And how do I make sure I know what I'm going to pay? These are all challenges that attacking them all at once isn't feasible, but attacking them one at a time, very quickly that snowball starts rolling and we see meaningful care changes in the healthcare system.
Yeah, and as you just said, taking it incrementally and not setting up that expectation or the difficulty of saying, oh, we have to get everything all at once. But as you said, take it step by step allows it to feel more manageable, and then you can see tangible progress. so kind of thinking in that direction, what do you think that first step could or should be?
So I think one of the first steps is with the adoption of artificial intelligence and machine learning models, and then couple that with the rules base that's really firm around anything federal regulated, right? You have commercial members that may have Medicare entitlement because they're under the age of 65. And that's an incremental step we can all take because it's a fringe case, right? You don't have a ton of people under 65 that are eligible for Medicare, but the rules for when you're eligible are really well understood. So it's more a matter of building the right models to pick off the claims, pick off the claim history, and predict that the 52-year-old guy in his fifth back surgery might be on the road to being fully disabled. And go try to solve that in the claim workflow process instead of as a pay and chase. Or take that roster and scrub it ahead of time and bounce it against other systems proactively for people that you know are going to be high users. And get to the point where the individual, the human eyes that are needed on claims, like how do we augment that so that it's not a daunting list of 2.5 million members, but it's maybe 4,000 or 5,000 members that have conditions or have claim history that indicate they should be looked at. So we could attack it a little bit at a time and just keep moving it forward in incremental pieces. Whereas things like baby rules and dual coverage, there's some lags in that. So can it be moved? Can it be done sooner? Yes. But is it a bigger project and higher risk? Yes.
And as you said, emphasizing those fringe cases sounds like a good way to kind of test and vet and then verify different models that maybe could then be scaled to tackle the more challenging problems. And for those of you just joining, I'm talking about Dan Gallagher from Lyric. We've been talking a lot about the coordination of benefits process. And Dan, kind of one of the last pieces you just touched on was that the role of Medicare and the impact of regulations. So I guess thinking broadly about the COB process, how have the regulations shaped it or potentially constrained what's happening with COB?
So there have been a couple of regulations and things that govern COB. The National Association of Insurance Commissioners, NAIC, has had guidance on how to coordinate benefits dating back to 1971. CMS frequently updates rules for Medicare eligibility. That's another one. But then kind of the last piece that you've seen happen is things like working spouse rules that are at the employer level, where whether a combined family of two adults in the home, right? If they both have coverage, each plan has their own rules on if the other member of the family can be covered or what the rate would be to cover those. So chasing those three things around really is what introduces both the complexity to COB, but it also introduces a path to solving it to some extent.
Yeah, and kind of that path to solving it, what do you think that path could potentially look like? And, is that combining those three sources, or are there one or two that are potentially stronger and clearer and more consistent?
I think it really depends on the situation and what perspective you're taking. So, the three primary forms of insurance in the U.S. are commercial-based policies, which are most of your Blue Cross plans for people who are at work. You have Medicare, which is primarily for people that are retired. And then you have Medicaid, which is frequently for people that have special needs or other situations where they're using that safety net. So if you take those three sides of the cube, depending on which side you're at, you're trying to figure out, well, does this person, have they gained commercial coverage? Have they gained Medicare coverage? And then you flip to the other side and you can imagine the permutations, and then add in a healthy dose of things like COBRA, for people between jobs, which aligns more closely to commercial. And then maybe things like work comp, which is episode specific potentially, but it could go on for a period of time. Somebody with a shoulder injury that caused them to leave a job, but they're not fully disabled. The shoulder injuries may have to go back to the work comp side. So I think depending on who you are and which side of the cube you're looking at, depends on which regulations you're going to lean on to help you solve the problem. But ultimately, it just comes back to having the right information and being able to efficiently process that information. And that's where generative artificial intelligence could be a really good thing for reading the regulations and interpreting the rules, and then getting back to identifying the member populations that need closer look, need human intervention. Again, it's how do you get 5 million lives cut down to a very small number to watch, where a 25-year-old single guy that has going in for a flu shot, maybe that's not somebody we have to pay attention to nearly as much as somebody with a number of comorbidities that's getting a little bit up in age, that had previous military service or previous injuries, right? So really, it's how do you target the system to look at those things and allow the other things to flow freely? Because the last thing you want is to pause claims for people and create strain on a system to stop and investigate something where there's nothing there.
Yeah, and that definitely all circles back to your earlier points around wanting to make it drive the efficiency and have. And it sounds like that also would grow out of the better integration. And you've mentioned a couple of times now that the potential power for generative AI and machine learning. So looking at those forms of technology, from in your opinion, what do you think would be necessary to help appropriate development and training of those tools to provide the benefits that you think they would be able to layer into the system?
So I think the first thing is to make sure that the public, the providers, and the payer network know that whatever's being done with AI is being done responsibly. It's models being built without bias. It's people being able to understand what data is being used, how it's being used, and really just having that supreme confidence that it's being used for positive intents and not being used to go sell you something later or do something else. But with that said, once the data rights are there, COB is an interesting spot to jump off for some of this model development, because it marries two sets of data. It marries claims data with eligibility data. And now when I put the two of those things together, I can do some risk stratification. I can look at a claims history and frequency at which somebody changes jobs. And again, I identify conditions that proactively can be looked at. I can potentially do some member mapping if I have enough scale in the eligibility space and in the COB space, to where I could potentially proactively identify working spouses. So then the birthday rule becomes a little bit easier to enforce. I can then take that data and identify other conditions and comorbidities, not just the risk of a member, but conditions that they would need. And then the last thing is I could provide some enhancements to the employer reporting I'm sending back. I could, if I get the data sources closest or together, I could give that feedback to the employer groups to let them know in more real time, how are their members using their benefits and how effective is that, so that these things aren't done. Again, we talk about data lag being a big problem. Well, how do we shorten the cycles on the feedback to improve the care? As an employer, do you want to know if benefits are being used well and which benefits are being used? Or do you want to wait a year and then get a report 3 months after the year's over to find out that what you did and that you just renewed wasn't being used? So there are a lot of opportunities at this intersection of AI technology and this COB function to really jump off to make some meaningful changes.
Yeah, and kind of given those potential benefits that you just described, which really seem to cut across the interests of all the different players involved, because you're talking about the payers, you're talking about the plan sponsors, who could be the employers. Who do you think is going to or should assume the primary responsibility for trying to drive this integration and alignment of data?
That's a really good question. And it goes back to, if you think about how the majority of commercially insured members are part of employer groups, right? So the employer group has a responsibility to pay. The payer or the logo on the card, called a Blue Cross plan, I'm not going to pick on anybody specific, has a responsibility to administer that benefits program correctly. The member also has a responsibility to know what their coverage is and what they're doing. And then the provider, seeing a person's medical history, may have an insight that's kind of hiding or not readily apparent to really see that something may be changing. So I don't think the responsibility necessarily falls in one place, but I think this goes back to the data integration layers across healthcare are probably the best places equipped to solve it, even if they're not the one supremely responsible for designing and marketing that solution.
Yeah, and kind of, as you said, that alignment and self-interest to some degree of having it happen. But it also seems like it then just ties back into some of the broader kind of forces happening across healthcare, where there is the ongoing drive to try and promote, value and quality and efficiency. And it would seem like that should hopefully get people more on the same page, as opposed to, all these different constituencies that we were talking about, seeing each other as being at odds with each other. So it kind of seems like it all comes back to, and I hate to say it, the coordination, and recognizing the fact that if everyone's working together, you can produce better outcomes that are going to work for everybody involved.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there, Matt. And I think the spot with it is we have to start with a little bit of trust, and we have to start with a case where that trust can easily exhibit itself. And then you take that first small step, and then you make the next one and the next one and the next one. And that's where taking a little bit of risk, right, of maybe moving a coordination of benefits process from a primarily back end for recovery, and what's the small piece of it you can move to the front. And then it's seeking a little bit of real-time access. There's always a tension between payers and providers of who's going to share information, and are you only sharing information necessary to reduce a payment or cause a denial or create administrative burden. So can we find the right cases to show that by working together, we reduce abrasion, we reduce administrative expense, and we enhance the patient experience?
Yeah, and I like that, tying it back to what you said earlier of the small steps to produce the victories or the successes can feed upon each other and create that snowball effect. So I think that's a great reminder on that point. And Dan, believe it or not, we're already almost out of time. So I'm going to close with one final question, which is kind of what I always like to do with my guests. But it's, so if you had a magic wand, what immediate change would you make to the COB landscape?
If I could do anything, I would connect the employer groups and that eligibility information and find a way to feed it directly to the providers up front. And to me, that's not just the eligibility information, but it's the individual information about the employer and the benefits that they offer. Because having been a patient and going in and talking to a doc about, I'm a runner, and talking to them about a hip injury or knee injury, if the doc knows up front what other benefits are available through my employer, maybe that changes the care discussion, or at minimum makes it more meaningful. But also, if I know my coverage is good on the day something happens, it maybe eliminates the need to wait for care or the need to call back for something else. And as care becomes more immediate and those interactions become more meaningful, everyone's well-being gets a little bit better.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good thought to part on. And also, I think one of the more concrete answers I've had to an immediate change question. So, maybe we'll see more people pushing for that in this area. But as I said, believe it or not, we are already out of time. I want to thank my guest, Dan Gallagher, for a great conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me. And I really enjoyed this time.
And thank you to everyone listening. Keep the dialogue going and connect with me at #HCDEJURE. I'm Matt Fisher. Until next time.